And thank you all for coming here. I'd like to start by making it perfectly clear that I am neither an historian nor a scholar, and not really much of a public speaker. So we're just going to show you some pictures and kind of ramble through. I tried earlier this week writing a script and finally decided, no, we'll just use the slideshow that I put together to trigger various stories. I see here in the audience some actual historians and quite a number of people who traveled with me through the 70s. And so I'd like to encourage you to consider this a bit of a conversation, and if you have a question, I know there will be a Q&A when we're finished, but if you have a question or a correction that you'd like to make to my reminiscing, please put your hand up and feel free to chime in. I see I have relatives in the room, so that takes care of coming out to the family. As Michael said, this all started for me in 1970. In the spring, I was 19 years old, and I serendipitously ended up writing a column for the Georgia Straight. It's all my Aunt Gladys's fault. My favorite aunt was my dad's elder sister, Gladys, who lived in Kitsilano. And we were very close, and one day I was having tea with Aunt Gladys, and she said, Kevin, I've got something I think you might be interested in, and she handed me a newspaper. It was something called the Georgia Straight, and Aunt Gladys said, the hippies are selling this on all of the streets down here in Kits, and I thought you might be interested. So I took the Georgia Straight home, and looking through the Georgia Straight, and I'm 19 years old. I know I'm gay. I come out to a few friends. I've never been to a gay establishment. I have no idea what the scene is all about, or that there even is a scene. But in the back pages of the Georgia Straight, there's these classified ads, some of them quite salacious, and as I later discovered, some of them completely made up, because I made up a few myself. But they were very well read, and one of them was an ad from a nightclub downtown looking for applicants for the position of go-go boy. Now, no, I was not thinking I might be a go-go boy, but I was thinking, if they're looking for a go-go boy, I'll bet this is a gay club. And so I headed on down to what turned out to be a little street corner hole in the wall called Faces, and paid I think it was $1 for a membership, and probably another $1 for admission. I didn't have a drink that first evening when I showed up, because unbeknownst to me, it was, as most of the bars or most of the clubs were in those days, a bottle club. That's the way they worked. They would register as a nonprofit society. I don't honestly remember what Faces Society was. I remember it as having been the West Coast Music Appreciation Society, but I have been corrected on that by others. But you would buy your membership so you could legally come into the private club, and you bring your own bottle. Give it to the bartender would write your name on it, put on the shelf behind the bar, and then they would charge you an exorbitant amount for your mixer, because that's how they made their money off the bar, and you would enjoy your beverage. So this was kind of interesting, and I hung out there a few weekends in a row, and I discovered that around the corner was the pub where everybody drank before the evening started, a place called the Castle Hotel. And I'm thinking, this is a kind of an interesting opportunity, because I had discovered, when I was 15 years old in Port Hardy, I had discovered the power of the press by ending up writing the Teen Talk column for the local paper there. So I figured, I'm already a journalist. So I went down to the Georgia Straight office in Gastown, as it was then, and it was a collective theoretically, although it turned out that actually Dan McLeod had subsequently stole the paper from the collective by registering it as a proprietorship. There are still some sore feelings about that, but I went to the collective meeting and I said, hey, you guys need a gay column. And Dan looked at me and he said, are you gay? And I thought that might be kind of evident from my purple puffy sleeve shirt that I was wearing, but I said, yeah, I'm gay. He said, you know the gay scene? And I lied through my teeth and I said, oh yeah, I've been around. I know, I'd been to one club, remember, and one beer parlor. And he said, okay, you're hired, $20 a week, have your first column in by next Monday. And so it began. So I put together this little slideshow, as I mentioned. You saw me in the other photo in my long-haired splendor. This is a black and white photo that was taken about the same time. You may remember when the Pacific Center was first built, there was this concrete thing up in the corner, and that's where this was. And you can see the Granville Street bus in the background. A great Italian photographer named Franco Cettarella took this photo. Note the sandals. This was our hippie times. I was hanging out by then in Kitsilano, which was where the hippie scene was. I was reading tarot cards at the Last Chance Saloon. Anybody remember the Last Chance Saloon? and the scene overlapped with the gay scene and with the scene down in Gastown and the Georgia Strait. And I joined a Wiccan coven run by a crazy Welshman named Sean Davies, who styled himself the Warlock of Gastown. And if you ask nicely and you go into a little restaurant on Abbott Street called Jules, and you ask if you can see the back room, you can see the remnants of the circle that we painted on the floor in the back room there for our hodgepodge of pagan rituals. That was the time it was, and it was a lot of fun. The kind of the nexus of my stories is this Frank Herzog photo always gives me a little moment, because that's our Granville Street in the 70s. So this was actually, I think, a 1968 or 69 photo, but close enough. And on the left there, you will see the White Lunch. Now, the White Lunch in subsequent years had a bad rap, for the White Lunch was so called because it was exclusively white and it was a guarantee that there were no non-white people working in the kitchen and so on. I recently had an interesting correspondence from a granddaughter of one of the founders of the White Lunch disputing this, and if anybody's interested, I'd be happy to send you the letter I received from her, because she says that this is a canard and there's no basis in that given her family's history. But I had been to the White Lunch during the daytime with my grandmother, sometime in the late 50s probably, shopping. We'd go to have lunch at the White Lunch. It was a perfectly respectable place at noon for a grandmother to take her little kid and have a cafeteria lunch. However, later in the evening, it was less respectable. And it was where so many people from the club scene and the bar scene and the steam scene ended up late at night after the bars closed. If you didn't want to go to the Grinch's booze can and you were too high to go home, you couldn't sleep anyway, the White Lunch might very well be where you ended up. And 3 in the morning at the White Lunch is kind of where I heard a lot of the gossip that I picked up from my column. I titled my talk, and if I ever get it finished and published, my memoir, The People of the Post. And that seems a little obscure, so I need to explain it to you. Among the crowd that hung out at the White Lunch, and there were a lot of names there that you may have heard of. Jack Card was a very famous local choreographer. Raymond Hull was a best-selling author. And Olive, who is still very active in the community, was the DJ at one of the clubs, Champagne Charlie's, and would occasionally drop by to terrify us with stories of her childhood in a Jehovah's Witness family. And one of the guys who joined us frequently was a guy named Alan Judge. And Alan was amusing and entertaining and lots of fun, and he gave us a name. He explained that he had seen a movie once, and if anybody's seen this movie when I describe it, please tell me what it was, because nobody could remember the name of the movie. But the movie is set in some kind of asylum, and there's an exercise yard in the asylum where all of the inmates went to exercise, and there was a post in this exercise yard. I don't know if it was a tetherball post or a watchtower post, or that sort of thing is kind of lost to time unless you remember the movie, but a group of people in the asylum used to meet at that post, and they called themselves the people of the post. They claimed to one another that they were not nearly as crazy as everybody else in the asylum, that they had that they were a great deal more of some things and a great deal less of others than anyone else there. And Alan said, we were the White Lunches people of the post. We were not nearly as crazy as the drunks and the junkies and all the other riffraff who sort of were, family in a way, but still it was a pretty crazy scene. And Alan said, we were not like them. We were the people of the post. A very celebrated artist, and I hope you can see some of this, was a man named Rand Holmes. Rand did comics, cartoons, the Harold Head comics being his most famous. This is a comic book he did about the White Lunch. I may or may not have inspired some of the characters in this. I don't actually see myself, but I certainly see some people I knew. Rand, by that time I was living upstairs on Powell Street above the Georgia Strait, and Rand would occasionally crash in my loft apartment, as did a number of other curious people like Doug Bennett, who later became Bennett and the Slugs, and Rob Geldof, who later apparently went on to musical fame. And he did this. And this is what it was like. He wasn't far off. It was pretty crazy at 3 a.m. at the White Lunch. It wasn't all fun and games. This was a period of social unrest, protests, oppression, and I was there, although not an active participant, in a lot of interesting events. Such as the Gastown riot. My main memory of the riot is being in the office of the Georgia Strait, and we had rolls and rolls of toilet paper that somebody had run out to get as people were coming in with blood coming down their cut heads. The police literally waded into the crowd on horseback and were swinging their batons, and if anybody was actually rioting, it was the police. We had the Easter Inn in the park, which was a protest, and when somebody wanted to build a hotel down at the entrance to Stanley Park, we squatted and set up a camp. I used to go down from my apartment on Robson Street and help at the campfire cooking dinner for the squatters in what we called the People's Park. That was a successful protest. There's no high-rise hotel there today. And this spirit of protest in our community, and I'll get to some of the actions that were taken that I was involved with or witness to, actually began in 1958. I was 8 years old, so I was not involved. But a man named Ted North put on a dress and stood on the steps with some friends of the Vancouver courthouse with a sign saying, "I am a human being." And I'm sorry, some of the people I'm talking about were really dear friends of mine, and I might get a little, from time to time, forgive me. The police ran them off. That was that. But that was probably Vancouver's first gay protest. Thank you, Ted. If you're ever in the West End, you might have noticed that they've given the community activists names to all of the lanes in the West End. And the one 2 blocks from my home is Ted North Lane, and every time I walk past, I have a moment. See, I can't see my notes, but with this on, I can't see you, so who knows, you know. Before the 70s, it was not that there was no gay scene at all, but nothing that I can bear witness to. When I came out in the early 70s, there were people who were 10, 20 years older than I was, who did tell me stories about places like the New Fountain, which had another incarnation years later as the talk of the town. I don't know if the building is even still there, but it was a beer parlor, and for reasons that escape me, it had become a gay hangout. Another one was down near Main Street on East Hastings. There was an upstairs place called the Montreal Club. And I believe some of the older people here may have been at the Montreal Club. I was told by someone who was a waiter there at one point that it had been some kind of a speakeasy years before, and when it was the Montreal Club, they still had the round wooden tables with the drawers that if the police came up and the little light would go on because the front desk would see the police coming up the stairs and they'd let you know, and you put your bottle in the drawer under the table. And again, that was before my time, but I've heard some interesting stories about the Montreal Club. But when I came out in 1970, the gay scene was just really starting to boom. I mentioned earlier the Castle. The Castle pub was the gay drinking bar. It had become that because years earlier, when the Hotel Vancouver had been on the corner where Nordstrom's is now, the story goes that there was a corner downstairs in the beer parlor of the hotel that was a gay hangout. It wasn't official, there were no pride flags or anything like that, but it sort of became known in the gay circles that that's where you went for a beer on a Saturday afternoon if you were looking to hang out with other friends of Dorothy's. And when they tore the hotel down, that crowd just sort of picked up and walked across the street, plunked themselves down in the Castle. That wasn't always smooth sailing. The Castle management weren't all that happy, and by the late 60s, it had become quite hostile, to tell you the truth. The first time I went in there, and a waitress named Helga sold me my first underage beer because I was still 19 and the drinking age was 21. It all seemed pretty calm, but there were stories, and I did see a few instances where if somebody got a little frisky, if you were holding hands, if you were necking with somebody in the corner, the waiters would come and either severely tell you to, button up there, buddy, or throw you out. People were being thrown out. And it was getting increasingly hostile, according to the people we used to hear stories from at 3 a.m. at the White Lunch. And that's where I first heard about the Castle Kiss-In, sometime in the early 70s. And we actually have in our audience here tonight Vancouver's gay historian and archivist, Ron. If at any point I miss something, put your hand up and correct me. Ron Dutton is our archivist and is largely responsible for the preservation of so much of our history. Somebody showed up and said, do you know what's going to happen? What's going to happen? They're going to do a protest at the Castle against all this abuse. What kind of a protest? It's going to be a kiss-in. We had the be-in, and now we're going to have a kiss-in. So I went there, and as did so many other people, and on some sort of a cue, everybody started smooching and necking and cuddling, and It was pretty wild. The waiters did not like it. They got shouted down. It carried on. They called the police. The police, now, by the time they called the police, I'd chickened out and I'd left. I had other clubs to go through, drag shows to review, steam bath to end up at. I was a busy guy, but I didn't see the police arrive, but I'm told the police walked in, took one look at the situation, says, and left. Shortly thereafter, I think what happened was the castle owners and management sort of threw their hands up and said, you know, we can see which way this is going. Very shortly thereafter, they hired a gay man as their manager. His name was Terry Wallace, and he managed it for many years. If you're ever downtown for gay pride events, you may have heard of the annual Terry Wallace Pancake Breakfast, which happens on Davie Street during Pride. That's a memorial and a tribute to Terry, who managed that bar until it closed in 1990 and then took his whole crowd down the street to another hotel bar called the Royal. Very fitting, the Queens at the Royal. So that was the castle. It was a great place to get ready, have your first few drinks of the evening before you headed on to the rest of the scene. As an indication of how important the castle was to us, when it closed in 1990, Joe Average, whom I'm sure you've all heard of, did this cartoon about the closing of the castle. So it was, as my headline says, pubs, clubs, and tubs. It has to be acknowledged and understood and recognized that bottom line here, it was about sex. We had grown up in a culture where we were bullied, we were marginalized. You couldn't ask your best friend to come to the prom with you, or if you were a university student, you couldn't hold hands in the student union pub. You just didn't. We needed places to be. To meet people, yes, to make friends, but let's face it, we wanted to get laid too. And I don't think there's any shame in admitting that that's what it was all about. Some gay businessmen who had some money and found some opportunities started opening these clubs. John Stephenson took over what had been a historic jazz club called the Bunkhouse and turned it into Champagne Charlie's, which was Vancouver's first main big drag venue. And Faces, the Corral, the Thunderbird. You can go on. Some years ago, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, I was writing a twice monthly column for Extra West. And one day I crunched the numbers. I made the lists. In 1974, we had more than twice as many nightclubs, bars, and steam baths dedicated to the gay community than we had in 2014 when I wrote that piece. And I don't think the ratio has changed much since then. A lot of things are this decline, as some people see it, of the gay scene is a result of a number of things. So a big thing is the internet. And another big thing I feel is that a lot of young people no longer feel the need to go out to a specifically gay space because they've grown up out and open. All their friends are accepting, and if they're going to go out and party, wherever they go is their place. So, and when people lament the decline of the gay bar scene, I'm inclined to say, but doesn't that kind of mean that we won? And, I get some pushback on that too. So this is a membership card. Oh dear, it's Andre Tardif. Don't anybody tell Andre? Andre Tardif is a great, he lives in Toronto, but he was here for many years. He comes back often, and he has an amazing archive of videos and photographs that he's done over the years. And the tourist baths was up on Hornby Street. And I was there opening night. All I really remember of the opening night was the owner of what was then the B&B, the Betwixt and Between Club, down at the bottom of Richards, later became the Playpen South, was there with a bottle of champagne to celebrate. And I remember being in my little warming room, or whatever they call the little cubicles, which were, well, never mind. And they were built so the walls were about that high, and I look up and there's Keith with his bottle of champagne, making his way along the top, waving this bottle of champagne. That's all I remember from that night. The rest of it is lost. But this was another great location, the music room. The music room started first in 1971 as Hampton Court. That didn't work out very well, and it was taken over by the guy who ran Champagne Charlie's, and he put a guy named Jerry Gauguin in to manage it. Jerry Gauguin, I had met some years earlier when he was a waiter at a place called the Banjo Palace in Gastown, an unabashed screaming queen. And when he called the Georgia Strait to let us know that he'd taken over Hampton Court and was opening the music room, of course I had to go and check it out. Jerry, I recognized immediately. He invited me up the stairs behind the bar to the little office that looked over the dance floor and the bar, sent down for some drinks, said, "What do you have?" I said, "Gin and ginger." Somebody brought the gin and ginger up, and Jerry opened a little glassine envelope and poured some white powder in and stirred it up. He said, "There, that'll make the party go." And it did. Jerry and I don't really remember whether it was, we think it was probably speed. Jerry is still with us. He's almost 80 years old. And I wish he was here to tell some stories. On the other hand, we'd never go home. At the music room, then, and this is Roger Hurston's membership card. Roger recently passed. He was, again, another pillar of our community for many, many years. I mentioned at the very outset that the first place I was in was Faces. This is Faces. Can you see? No, you can't. Today, right on that corner, and that is the northeast corner of Robson and Seymour, there's a Rogers Wireless. A few years ago, I went in one day, and the place was empty except for 2 or 3 kids who were working the counter. And so I walked up to them and I said, how would you feel if a bunch of old guys about my age came in one day with a boombox and put on some 70s disco music and started dancing? And I could see they're thinking, okay, do I call security? And I said, just kidding, just kidding. I said, but I'd like to tell you that this was Vancouver's first gay disco. And I said, the bar where you are now was the bar. The dance floor was here. This was the little stage where the Go-Go Boys performed. And they were fascinated. This is another shot. You can see the door. This is the Ambassador Hotel next across the parking lot from which my father's car was towed several times. And that was Faces. You opened that door and you found yourself in a little antechamber about 5 feet square with a teller's grill, and if you had your membership, they'd buzz you in, and that's where it all happened. But talking about protests, Faces, like many of the other clubs at the time, was men only. This was a period during which the male and female gay communities were starting to connect. Politically, because lesbians were discovering the second wave feminism and were getting involved in that, and were kind of schooling us, and we're also involved with some of the liberation groups that were springing up in Vancouver, the Gay Liberation Front, the Gay Alliance Towards Equality, Lambda. And we had a lot of friends who were lesbians. And friends who weren't lesbians, but I wanted my sister Lynn to come in and with her husband and see what this was all about. I have a great picture of Sandy St. Peter's sitting on my brother-in-law's knee. So again, one night somebody tips me off. There we are at the White Lunch, and you should know, Kevin, something's been planned for next weekend. You ought to write about it in next week's paper. We're going to have a protest at Faces. We're going to protest that they won't let women in. So I'm at Faces that evening, and somebody comes in and says, Kevin, you've got to see this. And out on the little sidewalk out there, there's not a big crowd, maybe half a dozen, maybe 8 people with little homemade placards, let the women in, and lesbians are our friends. And it was peaceful. Nobody called the police. It didn't last for very long. Off they went, and I think what happened was that the owners of the management of Faces, like the management of the castle, kind of saw which way the wind was blowing, and the next thing we knew, Faces was an all-bodies discotheque, and that went on well into the 80s, and that was our little protest there. I'd like to, if you were hoping, I should have mentioned, if you were hoping for some deep analysis of the socio-political situation at the time, you're talking to the wrong guy, or listening to the wrong guy. I was a party boy, and all of that sort of stuff didn't really register with me. Some of you will remember the name Stan Persky. I still have a fond memory of Stan, who was one of the founders of the Gay Liberation Front in Vancouver, trying to explain to me the nuances of Marxism, Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, and Trotskyite. And it was excruciating. I just wanted to go and get a drink and head to the baths. It was, speaking of protests, I was so unengaged with that, although I was reporting on them, and they sent me letters announcing their events and their meetings, and I covered them like a good gossip columnist should. But they were very unhappy with me, and the Gay Liberation Front, after a few months, came down to the Strait Office to protest and demand that my column be dropped. I was not politically aware. I was perpetuating homosexual stereotypes by writing about clubs and steam baths and drag queens. So the Georgia Strait dropped me. That, I think, lasted 3 or 4 weeks, because what they discovered was that street sales of the paper plummeted downtown. The market ruled, and they split the difference, and they brought my column back, and they had a weekly column called Gateway, which was by a group called the Gay Alliance Towards Equality. And so we shared space in the paper for a few years. But yeah, so I really can't tell you very much about the politics of the time. I can, however, tell you about the police. Now, we didn't have it nearly as badly as some places did. We all have by now read the stories of the police raids in Toronto and Montreal, and the bars and the baths, the perp walks, the releasing of patrons' names to the news media, who of course published them and ruined people's lives and broke up families. It was pretty awful. Nothing quite like that happened here. But that doesn't mean that the Vancouver City Police were angels. And I'll share with you my two first experiences. One was in Gastown, 71, and I was walking from the Georgia Strait up Abbott Street to get a bus somewhere, and I crossed an alley. It was late at night. There were 2 Vancouver police standing there in the alley putting the boots to a junkie who was lying and curled up on the cobblestones in the alley, literally putting the boots to him. They stopped when they saw me. One of them looked up and said, "Can I help you, sir?" And I just shook my head and kept going. But it wasn't a great first impression. Neither was my second impression. A year later, maybe, I'm living in an apartment on Broughton Street, and one evening my door bursts open and 3 Vancouver cops walk in, show their badges. No warrants, no nothing. We hear you're selling pot here, which was not true. They were about 10 years early for my pot dealing career. But, you know, the 2 of them tore my apartment apart, pretending to look for pot, while the lead cop went right to my desk, which was in my breakfast nook, where my typewriter was and stacks of papers, and started looking through the letters from my readers, and looked up and he said, so you are that faggot in the Georgia Strait. Again, not a really great early impression. I know things have changed, and I know some things haven't changed, but those things stick with me. And I revisited those stories in print when the Pride Society some years ago decided to exclude the Vancouver Police from the Pride Parade. And there was a huge petition that demanding that the police not be allowed in the parade. I and a guy named Gordon Hardy, who was one of the co-founders of the GLF back in the day, and 2 trans friends of mine, and a black woman who joined with us, started a counter petition which got 3 times as many signatures but had no effect. We felt that we had made so much progress that to throw the police out of the parade at this point was regressive and was going to destroy years of efforts on the part of various groups and committees and liaisons that had been formed over the years. So although I don't forget, I know things have changed, and I still believe that the Vancouver City Police should be in that parade. But I'm sure that I'll get some disagreements here. Yes?
Sorry, I'm curious, the cops raiding your apartment,
yes,
who started ruffling through your things, do you think they were looking for names or for information?
You know, I was so shocked, and later I don't remember whether they took notes or not. They didn't take anything away with them. It was all left behind. But I also, many years later, discovered through somebody else's Freedom of Information request that during that period, I was on a national RCMP and collaboratively City Police watch list. I was under surveillance. I was a dangerous homosexual. I don't know how much trouble I was causing in the clubs and the steam baths, but there you go. You know, I was hanging out with drag queens. That couldn't be good. So I was under surveillance, and I'd also, apropos of the police, like to assure you that if their surveillance techniques and their resources and their sources today are as good and smart as they were then, nobody has anything to worry about. I read through all of these reports. They spelled my name wrong. They got so many details about my comings and goings wrong. They got, apparently I moved to Los Angeles at one point and gave my column to somebody named Brody Green, who never wrote for the Georgia Strait. Yeah, no, don't worry about it. If they're watching you, pay no attention. They have no idea. But one of the things that also started at the White Lunch, one night I was sitting there with the gang, the people of the Post, and at the next table there were 3 drag queens who were packing it in for the night, and I overheard them talking. I knew one of them quite well, a queen named Chrissy Warren, who you'll see pictured here. And they were talking about how they didn't have a place to work and live anymore, and they couldn't live in so-and-so's place because of this, and they couldn't rent because of credit ratings or whatever. And on impulse, which is how I've followed most of my life, I said, well, I can get us an apartment, and I'm looking for a place to live. So we ended up renting an apartment on Butte Street, just a block and a half north of Davie, very convenient for the girls. And I became a madam. Mr. Madam, Chrissy called me. Well, I wasn't really a madam. My responsibilities were limited to cleaning up a bit, paying my share of the rent, keeping an eye on some of the tricks, going down when we had a they had a deal with a couple of cab drivers. Somebody's looking for some action. They'd pull into the parking lot behind the building and blink their headlights into our window. I'd go down and let somebody in, and then I'd make myself scarce. And there were always a couple of actual girls working there because, as I was told, and again, you know, this may be an urban myth, but I'm told that at the time, prostitution was illegal, but only if you were a woman. The worst they could charge a drag queen with was loitering or vagrancy. That apparently nobody in Ottawa had tumbled to the possibility that somebody might want to pay a male for sex. So Chrissy and Tony and Jose would go out and find their Johns and bring them back. And if in the meantime the Johns had figured out what was going on and this wasn't what they wanted, well, Bonnie and Dagmar were there, and you know, I don't know what happened in the back rooms. I was just in the kitchen getting spaghetti and meatballs ready for everybody at 2 a.m. Before I sat down and pounded out my next column. That all came to a crashing end one day when early in the morning there was a knock on the door, and I went to the door. This was kind of scary because nobody ever came in without being brought in by one of the girls. And so there's these two guys standing there. I'm looking for some action, dude. And, you know, and I said, oh, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, no, we got Dagmar's behind me pulling my shirt, so she wants to have one more trick tonight. But it all just felt wrong, and I closed the door. And then I said, listen, kids, I'm going to go down to the Taurus, the steam bath, get myself a steam. That's all, just a steam. And so I'm leaving the building. St. James Court is still there. And there's a paddy wagon just half a block down from the building. And the two guys who were just at our door are standing there talking to the two cops in the front seat of the paddy wagon. I went on to the Taurus. I phoned home. I said, okay, it's all over, kids. Pack it in. We've been spotted. And that was the end of that story. My brief career as a madam. Not the socio-political commentary that you perhaps were looking for, but this is what I got. So the sex trade in the West End blossomed in the subsequent decade. And some of you have encountered a documentary called Hookers on Davie. And this queen on the poster here, that's Chrissy. She was the star of this documentary. I personally haven't seen this documentary, partly because I think I might choke up a bit. I was very close to Chrissy and very good friends with a lot of the girls who were working the streets in those days, and I know the stories. I don't need to see a documentary, and so I've never seen it. Maybe someday I will, but you can find it online. It's a National Film Board documentary, and yeah, you might find it very interesting. They were drag queens before they were anything or anyone else, and many of them started in show business, doing shows. First of all, at Champagne Charlie's, then at BJ's, and the next thing we knew, at the Thunderbird in Phase 3 in the August, and it was a going concern. If you are involved in drag or know someone who is, I hope you've heard the name Dee Dee Ambrose. Dee Dee is really the grand godmother of drag in Vancouver. Dee Dee was the diva at Champagne Charlie's, 69, 70, through to 71, I think, when the owners of BJ's stole Dee Dee away, along with her doo-wop girls, Charity and Sandy St. Peter's. This is another James Lowen photo of Dee Dee, as she was at that point beginning to live in drag, as we would say at the time. And Dee Dee went on in subsequent years to be, and again, the language has changed, but she was Vancouver's first sex change. So a pioneer in a number of regards. The last time I saw Dee Dee was sometime in the early 90s. She was visiting from Edmonton, where she had a housekeeping business, wasn't doing shows or anything like that anymore, but it was lovely to catch up. And so, yeah, Dee Dee Ambrose. You may have heard the buzz last fall when a documentary called The Empress of Vancouver opened the Vancouver International Film Festival, and with a screening at the Playhouse Theatre. The Empress of Vancouver, the subject of The Empress of Vancouver, was Vancouver Empress 10, Olive. Now we're getting into empresses, and so I need to explain a bit that Ted North, who I've mentioned earlier, who was a drag performer at the August Cabaret, which he was co-owner of, came back from, I think it was an event in Portland or San Francisco. And I remember clearly sitting at the bar with Ted in the August, and he's briefing me on this so I can write about it in my column. And he's saying, QQ, this is going to be great. We're going to have an election. All drag queens are going to campaign to become Empress of Vancouver. Ted was very smart. He declared himself the Empress of Canada so that there would be, which he remained for the rest of his life. And we're going to have an election and a big celebration and a ball. And this is another kind of a moment for me. I remember patting him on the hand and saying, "Oh, Ted, this is going to end badly." Well, many years later, when Ted was at St. Paul's Hospital in his last weeks, I was up for a visit, and he grabbed my hand and he said, "Well, QQ, it didn't turn out so bad after all." He remembered that. So we had an election, and we elected Charity as our first Empress. She didn't last long, because shortly after that she moved down to the States with her new lover, and we only saw her periodically when she'd come up for various events. But this is Olive. Olive was into drag, but also performance art of various sorts. One of my earliest memories of Olive was at a warehouse party somewhere in the East Side, where Olive came out dressed in a whole bunch of big, colorful balloons, proceeded to do some kind of a number with a pin, pricking the balloons one by one until, of course, all that remained was Olive. Olive is still very much with us, and kind of the chatelaine of Davie Street in many ways. Charity was our first Empress, and as I say, shortly after her election, headed off to the States, came back periodically, but much of the work of the court, as it was called, the Dogwood Monarchist Society, fell on other shoulders. The aforementioned Sandy St. Peter's. This is another James Lowen photo, and one of my favorite pictures of Sandy. I told you that it was Sandy who outed me, and figured out that it was me who was writing that column in the Georgia Straight. I recently, as Michael said, received an award from the court, the Sandy St. Peter's Friendship Award, which was particularly touching for me because of my connection with Sandy. And speaking of the court, another drag queen who spent an awful lot of time doing entertaining, fundraising, supporting the community, coming up with great ideas, was a queen named Mona Lee, seen here in her youth at BJ's with another queen, not in drag here. The Rogers drag name was Eleanor, And this is Mona Lee. Mona was Vancouver's Empress too.
That's Bobby Blake.
Is that Bobby? Oh, God, all right, thank you. Which brings me to my next picture. Speaking of the court, and that's really Bobby Blake. Okay, I guess it was the glasses made me think it was Roger. Thank you. We have with us this evening Vancouver's second Empress, who has just celebrated her 50th anniversary as Vancouver Empress II, Mona Regina Alexandria Lee. I call him Reg. Reg, would you stand up and take a bow? Ladies and gentlemen, Vancouver Empress II. Any opportunity I have to embarrass you, Reg, you know I'll take it. And this gorgeous robe that you see Mona wearing was a work of many years and many hands, but so much of the beadwork that you see on this and the embroidery, Reg actually did himself with a group of friends who meet regularly to do this sort of work. They call themselves the Stitch and Bitch group. I've never been invited. I'm not a big enough bitch. A lot of the stories that that I've spoken of or alluded to are included in more detail and in a much grittier vein and probably much more accurately than I can in a book that was published last year. Aaron Chapman is here. I should have called you and asked you to bring some books, Aaron. Vancouver Vice tells it all. Well, as I say here, not quite smart enough to leave out some names that we won't mention unless you want to speak to us privately. But a terrific story and about that period, and among the threads that he uses to tie all those together is a 1984 murder of a man named Wayne Harris, whose body was found in the trunk of his car in Stanley Park. Aaron and I knew each other casually through these circles, and he called me up when he was working on the book, and he said, "Kevin, you were very much a part of the scene back then. Did you know Wayne Harris?" And I said, "Well, Aaron, I think you've kind of hit pay dirt. I knew Wayne Harris all too well, and the guy who murdered him was my ex-boyfriend. So we had to get together for some drinks." So by all means, Aaron has moved on to his next book, which is going to be all about restaurants and restaurant history, but please pick up a copy of Vancouver Vice and get a real sense. Reading this book, as I said to him later, was kind of like watching a movie where I knew I was just outside of the frame. Just outside of the frame. Just a little later I was there. Just before they did that, I was there. And I realized, it helped me realize something, because I knew a lot of the things that were going on, but I wasn't privy to a lot of the illicit activities, the prostitution, the drug dealing. And I realized, oh, of course not. They didn't invite me into those inner circles because I was a journalist. And they knew that I would write about anything and everything. I got a death threat once at a bar called the 616 on Robson Street. I had been writing about a guy who was trying to, there was a guy whose name I won't mention, who had tried a bit of a shakedown with some of the businesses in Chinatown and decided that he could expand a bit, and he had his goons going around a couple of the gay bars trying to extort some protection money. And one of the owners contacted me. We talked about it. I wrote about it. I didn't name names, but I said, this is happening, and this guy's going to find out that the gay scene is not quite that easy a nut to crack. So I'm on the dance floor at the 616, and a guy comes up to me and hands me a matchbook cover, you know, little folding matchbooks. And I take it, and he disappears, and I open it, and there's a bullet in the fold. And scrawled inside is a message that says, you keep writing like that, and this is for you. So That's the only actual death threat I've ever had. I got thrown head over heels once at BJ's by somebody who came up to me and said, "Are you QQ?" And I said, "Yes." And the next thing I know, I'm over his shoulder and flat on my back. I guess I'd written something that he didn't care for. But yeah, get a copy of Vancouver Vice. Anytime. So everybody has their decade, if you will. You know, everybody says my decade was such and such. I relate to the music of the period and the movies and so on. Our decade was the 70s. And some of us considered it to be kind of the longest decade because it really sort of started in 67 with the Summer of Love. And it came to a crashing end in 1982 when we put a name to AIDS. AIDS was devastating. We lost a lot. Names and faces now going through our minds as we even talk about it. But it also had a curious effect of bringing the community together in a new way. The drag court suddenly became so important. The drag queens were out front raising money for all of the organizations that were trying to help. AIDS Vancouver and PWA and Loving Spoonful and all of those groups, endless drag show fundraisers, and Reg was a big part of so many of those. And the lesbians stepped up, and they were tireless caregivers for the sick and the dying and comforting those who were left behind. It's kind of a tragic irony that it took something like that to bring our community into focus for so many of us, but it did. And so I'd like to sort of dedicate this little talk to the memory of those we lost through AIDS and those we've lost through old age and for other reasons who didn't make it through. And as the opening dedication in my book says, everything I dedicate to someone who wrote me a note when my column ceased in the Georgia Strait. And I received a note that said, "Kevin, I'm so sorry that your column is coming to an end. Your column was the first time we ever saw ourselves in print, when we weren't being made fun of or put down." And so I dedicate all of this to Mr. Sandy St. Peters. Thank you.
Now here tonight, the Emperor and Empress number 50 of Vancouver, and at their coronation night, which was 2 weeks ago, they presented an award for Kevin. This award came as a big surprise to Kevin. He wasn't able to be there because he was very ill at the time. So we'd like to present it to him tonight.
This individual has, for over 50 years, supported, honored, written about, and cheered on the drag community of Vancouver. An award-winning journalist, editor, arts, publicist, and self-professed wannabe hippie, this gentleman in 1970, was the first openly gay columnist to publish in a major Vancouver newspaper. Thereby providing us with years of brilliant documentation of the LGBT community. Upon the announcement of his retirement from the Georgia Strait publication, he received this note from Empress 3, Sandy St. Peters. Dear Kevin, we are going to miss your column so much. Your articles were the first time we had ever seen ourselves in print without being insulted and made fun of. Love, Sandy. Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in showing deep gratitude to the Sandy St. Peters Vanguard Award for Friendship to Kevin Dale McKeown.
Well deserved, well earned.